Hello and welcome back to The Note. Well, we've heard the great political and economic theatre from George Osborne, and we now have a new UK budget. It's had almost no impact on the markets that matter, but that's not particularly surprising. It still gives us a vital framework for the debate that is going to take up the country over the next year, going into the next general election. With me now to discuss this is our chief economic commentator, Martin Wolf. Martin, thanks for taking time to do this. First of all, what surprised you in this budget? What do you think were the main political points? Osborne obviously is very much a politician. What were the main political points he was trying to make here?
Well, I think what surprised me, well, it didn't really, because I know George Osborne, is that he produced quite a few rabbits from the hat of a populist type, but populist for his supporters. It seems to me pretty clearly a budget that will help the prosperous. So now tax allowances are raised all the way up the income tax threshold, including for higher rate taxpayers. There are a whole raft of changes for savings, which are clearly largely going to benefit really well off people. Think of the new ISA arrangement with £15,000 of savings. Well, not that many people in truth can save £15,000 a year. So it's again a limited number of people. He's given the usual popular things, or very much on beer and alcohol and spirits, but the aggregate of all this in terms of money is quite small. I'm rather in favour of the investment allowance changes, increases in investment allowance, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal.
Now, what about the broader picture? We are a year away from the election, and he is sending out what appears to me to be quite a clear message about fiscal discipline and about welfare spending. How do you think that will pan out?
Well, this is, I think, the core of this, both actually in substance and in politics. The Office for Budget Responsibility has not changed its view of the economy. So it thinks that our improved growth essentially means that we're borrowing from future income or future growth. The trend rate, the full capacity of the economy has not changed. So on that basis, we have to have a very, very tight fiscal policy, and Mr. Osborne is promising to get us to a budget surplus by the end of this decade. And he's saying, in addition, in essence, the document is full of this argument that we have to run a large budget surplus for the indefinite future to get the public sector debt ratio back to where we started.
No, and as I understand it, that also very directly implies that we will have to cut back welfare very substantially, and that presumably opens up a big philosophical gap with Labour.
His welfare cap is really quite tight because it's linked to inflation, and he clearly wants to bring the budget under control by bringing down spending. The charts show this very, very clearly. So this would be a budget, is a framework in which spending as a share of GDP will fall back to one of the lowest levels we've had since the war. I mean, it is certainly of the last 40 years. It's a very stringent promise on what the public sector will be doing in a time when demands will be rising 5 or 6 years from now. And it clearly opens up a good, strong, important philosophical debate.
Okay, and one final question. When we look at terms of the economic strength of the UK, it's currently having a surprisingly strong recovery. Does anything in this budget change the forecast for the next year or two, or does everything really rather rest with Mark Carney and the bank?
I think it's quite clear the budget is, from a macroeconomic point of view, an irrelevance. And indeed, he explicitly said, I'm relying on the bank. He's been relying on the bank throughout, and Mr. Carney is so far delivering.
Okay, Martin, thank you very much for finding the time to talk. In conclusion, I'm not going to differ from a word that Martin has just said, but I would like to make one final point about a genuinely very interesting and radical reform to pensions. It will now no longer be necessary for people to buy an annuity when they retire. In principle, I am thoroughly in favour of that. That's obviously a great idea. It offers people a lot more freedom. But I do want to say that it now becomes extremely important that the correct consumer protection measures are put in place. A lot of people who are not used to having a lot of money to play with are suddenly going to have large lump sums and will need a lot of advice, which needs to be good and honest advice before they allocate it. We do not want this very useful reform to become a licence for sharks to prey on the unwary.